I saw Bernie Sanders up there, and what most of us can't figure out, but people outside of the Beltway and outside of Manhattan can figure out, is how somebody could say, I like that Bernie Sanders guy, but if he's not there, I'll vote for Trump. And we've seen New York Times articles that talk about communities ravaged by the effects of the changes over the last 30 years. Either going for Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. The Times actually laid it out there. Can you explain what seems so foreign to all of us, how most Americans just aren't, or at least the swing voters, just aren't ideological?
Well, I'll try. Look, if you look at politics in America, Joe, over the last 30 years, we're conditioned to thinking about it as a contest down the middle of the field between right and left, between the 45-yard lines. That's where American politics takes place. But now, increasingly, the divide in the electorate is a horizontal line. It's between the elites who run institutions who've lost credibility and trust and everybody else. Elise is involved in a project that is fascinating. It's called Ashcroft in America, Lord Ashcroft from the United Kingdom. They're doing focus groups all over the country which are profoundly insightful to this question. But this is a global phenomenon. This manifested itself in the Brexit vote. It will play out with the French presidential elections, which are the third of these four globally consequential elections, and then ultimately the German elections, which will take place next September. And increasingly, the divide is between the elites and everybody else. And the permeability between a formerly solid wall that runs ideologically down the middle of the field that separates right from left, now there's a hole in it. Because a Trump voter and a Sanders voter are united in their belief that the system is rigged, that there's one set of rules for people at the top and a different set of rules for everybody else. And that defines politics today. Though I will say I was gratified to hear after he lost the election that Bernie Sanders was able to acquire his third home, which generally speaking is a lot of houses for a socialist.
Okay. So Mika, you know, something that I found that's fascinating also this election cycle is that every 4 years, I always know when I go to, go to friends' houses or relatives' houses or, just talk about elections, that Republicans line up on one side of the room and say, we're going to vote for the Republican candidate because the Democratic candidate is evil. And my Democratic friends line up on the other side of the room saying, we're going to vote for the Democratic candidate because the Republican candidate is evil. I really see a split this year for the first time. Again, at least in the areas that I circulate in, where it's not between Republican and Democrat, it's between haves and have-nots. Advanced degrees versus high school graduates, the rich versus the... It's just, it's pretty stunning how class distinction makes such a huge difference in America when we have long been we think, more of a class-free society than, say, Britain or France, Germany, the other countries that Steve Schmidt talked about.
Michael,
and Joe, to pick up on what Steve was saying, there's one word that Steve used a couple of times that is key, I think, to understanding where we are now in terms of this split within this country, our country. And it's the word loss. Too many people in the media, our business, coastal elites, where a lot of people live who are in our business, don't understand the loss that's taken place in this country over the last 20 or 25 years. Specifically, if you have a 20-year-old son today, serving in Iraq or Afghanistan, that child was 5 years old when this war began. That's 15, 16 years ago. And then along comes the winter of 2008 and 2009, when another loss occurs that shakes the foundations of the culture in the country. People lose homes, they lose incomes, they lose jobs, they're unemployed, they lose their 401k, they lose their life savings. And what are they thinking along the course of all of these years, a couple of decades, two and a half decades maybe, or 25 years? They're thinking this: they have no voice in government. that they are represented by a professional political class who just keep running for re-election and raising money to enhance their own futures and their own present status. But they don't talk about their lives. And what do they read and what do they hear now, lately, in the last year? If they go to a Trump rally, they're not going to a Trump rally to listen to a guy who they sort of like what he says without paying attention to who he is. They hear and read in the papers that they're probably racists for going to the Trump rally, and they take great offense at this, and they ought to take great offense at this, because we don't understand their lives and we don't cover their lives.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, they should. Amen,
100%.
amen, and amen.
Yeah.
You know, Mika, you can question Donald Trump and whether Donald Trump is a racist or not. We've had that discussion, but the media's broad brush of Trump supporters and Sanders supporters have been offensive from the start. Claiming that Sanders supporters were somehow young, insolent, ignorant children that had no idea what was in their self-interest, or that all Trump supporters were racist, bigoted, xenophobic, misogynist, rednecks. Deplorables.
Yeah.
Deplorables. And what else was that? Incurable, or what else did she say about it? Anyway, irredeemable. You know, the fact is, Willie, people that have been struggling for the past 30 years know what coastal elites, as Mike Barnacle said, haven't figured out. That this is an economy that has been on the decline for 30 years, 40 years. Average wages for men in decline, as Jeffrey Sachs says, in real terms since 1973. And just look over in this century. We were kept afloat by a tech bubble. Then we were kept afloat by a housing bubble, and then the only reason we didn't sink into a depression was because of a government spending bubble. There is no growth industry out there, and as we were saying on the set yesterday, you take all the Googles, all the Microsofts, all the Apples, all the Yahoos, all the everythings, combine all of those employees together that work for those companies, probably doesn't come close to matching how many people General Motors employed in 1964.
And instead of having that pain listened to, instead of having that pain addressed by elites in Washington, but also in the media, those supporters of Donald Trump feel like that pain has been mocked throughout this campaign. There's a reason when Donald Trump says the media is stealing this election from us and they've rigged the election, that his supporters by 81% believe that to be true, because they watch the media. They watch late night shows make fun of them. They watch the press make fun of them. They watch, you know, they're put on display, as you said, called racist in many cases. That doesn't mean the things Donald Trump is saying are the right solution to their pain. I think a lot of us agree that they have not been, but they feel like every time they hear themselves mocked on TV or in a newspaper or on a website, that divide that Steve's talking about grows larger and larger, and more damage is done, and we're pulled farther and farther apart.
For the first time in generations, kids not doing as well. That's the reality, that it appears to be being ignored by.
And I don't think that you can overstate the impact of the media and the anger against the media in this election. And that's something in the focus groups that, yes, the anger's there against our government, against our elected officials, against the rigged system, but also the media being biased on right and left about, I would say, 8 out of 10 people think that there's no hope for what the media puts in front of you, that it's just hopelessly
biased. I think history will look at this election and the media coverage of it.
That's why people hate Chris Cillizza, right, Chris?
Oh, well, there's the fix.
I've got to say, and I'll just say it, over the past couple weeks, media coverage has been
just
deplorable.
Careful now.
It has been deplorable. It has been one-sided. It has been biased. It has been every bit as bad as media coverage of the Bernie Sanders phenomenon at the very beginning of the Democratic process. It was slanted and biased against Bernie Sanders. It was completely weighted for Hillary Clinton. Sanders was holding massive rallies that everybody ignored, that everybody tried to explain away, and it's because, and Mike Barnacle nailed it, Chris Cillizza, we are all at the end coastal elites that didn't get Bernie Sanders and don't get why people would ever vote for Donald Trump.
Well, okay, let me say two things. I disagree with you, but I agree with you that I am a coastal elite. I went to a prep school.
Do you disagree or you agree?
I went to a prep school for high school. I went to Georgetown, and I've lived in Connecticut, and I've lived in D.C. So I fit all, and my house is inside the Beltway. So I fit all of those things.
You're a man of the people.
Oh, yes. But let me say this, Joe. I disagree with you about the media coverage being unfair, and let me tell you why in this last period. Donald Trump every morning gets on Twitter and does something like he did yesterday. He injects something that is not true, that there is widespread voter fraud that drives news cycles. People always say to me on Twitter and all these other things, why don't you just ignore him? Well, we can't ignore him. He's one of the two people who can be elected president. So I don't know what's unfair. He is creating news that we then cover. Am I biased in favor of defending what we do? Yes, absolutely. Has some of the media coverage, whether it's Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, been somewhat unfair at times? Sure, because the media is made up of a bunch of humans who get stuff wrong. But I don't think there's a concerted bias against Donald Trump. I think he is serving these things up.
I completely disagree.
Well, tell me why. Tell me why.
Well, because you know what? Look at the data after this election is over. Look at the number of stories that are overwhelming. Like Donald Trump can say something outrageous, which he says every day. At some point, that stops being news. And that will run the head of a newscast for 15 minutes. It's just like with Bernie Sanders. When Bernie Sanders was running, it would be Hillary Clinton coverage, Donald Trump coverage, and there would be 9 seconds of Bernie Sanders with a rally with 15,000 people talking about the system being rigged. And, you know, it's like Willie Geist said, and Willie, I think you said this a week or two ago. We're all offended by so many things that Donald Trump says, but we don't come to work every morning carrying a flag saying, I want to be able to tell my grandchildren that when the time was required it, I stood up to the man who was loathed by 73% of the American people.
Yeah,
and that's what it seems like we have.
It's this, and again, no way a defense of Donald Trump, but it's clear, it's right in front of us that many reporters decided several months ago that this had to be stopped and dropped their veil of fairness, which is a decision that some reporters made, and decided that he had to be stopped. Now, I think objectivity, and Mika, we've talked about this a lot, is a false idea.
It's just
human beings are not objective,
ridiculous.
But what you can be is fair. There's a difference between objectivity and fair, and you go out and you judge the stories on their merits. Well, again, Donald Trump has deserved most of the coverage he's gotten. Let's be clear about that.
Of course.
I think the fact that he is accused by 9 different women of doing these things is newsworthy and something that should be looked into. So he's earned the coverage he's had over the last 2 weeks.
So that's just quickly, that's my point. I totally 100% agree that there is a disconnect between large numbers of the media who have backgrounds like mine, okay, and people who support Donald Trump. I think the most offensive thing to do, and Republicans have long been covered like this, is cover Republican candidates, including Donald Trump, like animals in a zoo. Like, oh, hey, look at this one. Look what he's doing over here.
Right.
The idea that Donald Trump supporters are, and Joe, you went through xenophobic, misogynist, racist. I think the one that's the most offensive to me is they're all stupid.
That's it.
Which is ridiculous.
Right.
It's been proven out time and time again. So I think there's a difference between saying, look, the message is resonating, covering the group that supports him in a way that is not condescending. Well, if they knew better, they wouldn't support him. And then to Willie's point, though, how do we not cover when 9 women come forward against one of the 2 people who's a nominee? I know you're not saying that we shouldn't. I know that you're not saying that we shouldn't.
Of course you should.
Right.
Of course you should cover those stories. But even if you take that coverage out of it, and Mika and I have talked about this, not as much on the air as we're talking this morning, but Mika, I think there's a reason why Elise Jordan says one of the most telling things out of the focus groups have to do with the media bias, the disconnect between voters and the media, whether you're talking about Donald Trump supporters or Bernie Sanders supporters.
Look, I think from the get-go, Donald Trump and the whole concept of why people were instantly following him was rejected by the condescending liberal media. They missed the story, and they've been behind the 8 ball ever since. That's where we're at. And I'm not saying that they're trying to tilt the election or that these really dreadful allegations aren't true or are true, but they're important. I think the tapes are horrific. I also knew a lot of this stuff was baked in the cake with Donald Trump. And everyone else has been sort of fluttering around the concept of his candidacy because they just didn't get it. There's the Donald Trump that says incredible things, that stands for some things I can't even speak of. But then there's the people who see hope in his success and see hope in his candidacy. And that is something that reporters missed, that editors missed, that people were so horrified by the concept of Trump and stormed off this set that they missed the story. They missed the needs of the American people that haven't been met by Washington for decades. And
let me go to Elise here really quickly.
Please.
And Elise, from the focus groups you show, and this is why the media, instead of throwing tomatoes at their TV sets right now, should actually listen to what we're saying, because the losers at the end of the day, it's the mainstream media. People can go to Facebook now, and they do for their news. People can go to other social media outlets. Talk about the disconnect that you are finding out there across America between the media and the voters.
Well, you know, just in the earliest focus groups we did in Wisconsin, people were really concerned about Hillary Clinton's health, and it was at a time when it wasn't mainstream to discuss that she maybe wasn't as well as she was saying she was and had a cold in public. Then those people are derided as crazy. They're crazy for questioning that maybe something's up with Hillary Clinton's health. But then a couple weeks later, she has to leave the 9-event memorial service early. So it gives credence to these conspiracy theories when the mainstream media perhaps isn't being as tough on Hillary Clinton as Donald Trump.
well, again, I think we just have to do our best moving forward. It's always good actually to take about 10 or 15 or 20 minutes to take a look within.